It's officially afternoon. So good afternoon. Nice to see you all. My name is Ryan Allen. I'm Associate Dean for Research at the Humphrey School. Normally, you would have Nisha Bochwe here doing a welcome, and unfortunately, she is ill. So she's asked me to stand in for her. But she wanted to send her warm regards and appreciation to all of you for being here. So thanks again. In addition to this audience, we are also live casting this. So for those of you who are coming in via Zoom, welcome to you as well. We are especially grateful to the intrepid Norm Ornstein, who's with us. I say intrepid because he had a significant delay last night getting in from DC. We're very happy he made it. He's here at the Dean's invitation. His perspective and experience come at an important moment, and we are happy and glad to have an opportunity to host him in this conversation here at the Humphrey School. You see the title of it behind me. I'll let Larry Jacobs introduce it a little bit more fully. Before I do that, let me introduce the full panel, however. Joining the conversation today are two members of our Humphrey community. We have Professor Larry Jacobs, who leads the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance and brings a very deep expertise in American political institutions into this conversation. We also are very lucky to have Rachel Beety, one of our Masters of Public Policy students and Vice President of the Public Affairs Student Association. Are you lame duck yet, Rachel? Are you a lame duck yet? Do you have a new slate coming in? Are you?
Lame duck.
Yeah. We are talking about politics after all. I know there'll be a new group coming in. Rachel has been a great leader at the Humphrey School, and we're quite happy to have her here today. And this ensures, of course, a very valuable student perspective as a part of the discussion. So we'll have this. There'll be time for Q&A at the end, and we will wrap up promptly at 1 to be respectful for your time. At this time, I want to turn it over to Larry Jacobs, and thank you again all for coming. Larry.
Thank you very much, Ryan Allen. Thanks to all of you. Norman Ornstein, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
And welcome home.
Thanks. I want to recognize my brother who's here, my brother David, who was the city attorney in Bloomington for several decades and named as the municipal lawyer of the year for North America, actually. So I'm very happy to have my very accomplished brother here.
Wonderful. So we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation. We'll move forward and backwards and sideways. And Rachel, why don't you start us off?
Thank you again for coming, Norm. So I kind of want to start today here at home. As I'm sure you are well aware, 2026 brought a lot of trauma to Minnesota and the metro area here. I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on Operation Metro Surge, the violence of the ICE presence, and the response of not only our political representatives, state, local, federal, but also how our communities responded and resisted to those actions.
As a native Minnesotan, I was so proud of the way the citizens here responded. And when the Profiles in Courage Award was given to those citizens, it really made me happy to see that happen. Nothing else about it made me happy, obviously. And in a broader sense, what Operation Metro Surge and the other actions that the Trump administration has taken and is taking against Minnesota are chilling in way too many ways. It's not just the utter inhumanity and sadism involved in an immigration policy of this sort, including, of course, Stephen Miller setting quotas, which mean that these officers from or agents from ICE and the Border Patrol, of course, many of whom we now know are completely inappropriate to be there. And at some point, I'd love to get an accounting of how many January 6th violent insurrectionists who were pardoned have come back and joined ICE or the Border Patrol. That means that they've grabbed American citizens, they've taken these children. The fact is, you do the quota, you arrest them, you detain them. What happens to them afterwards doesn't matter to you. You've got your quota met. All of that, horrible as it is, and using, for Chicago, then Minneapolis, then the broader state as the kind of beta test for how far they could go before getting a reaction. And one thing I'll say about the reaction of citizens and most of those governing here is that if it had not worked out that way, if Minnesotans had cowered back in fear, if they had not turned up with their phones and their cameras, we in this country would be in a much worse place. It really was a response that required, I mean, first of all, it created a larger backlash in the country, especially the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, but even more broadly, just seeing all of that violence, but seeing that citizens could stand up and then force some change in policy mattered a lot. And I think it's a template that we'll see in other places. But it's also more broadly what the Trump administration is doing to states they don't like, to people who are governing that they don't like. Trump doesn't like Minnesota, first because it voted against him, even if he says he won it. It voted against him. Second, he doesn't like it because Tim Walz ran as part of a ticket against him. He doesn't like it, and so he's going to punish it. And it wasn't just the Operation Metro Surge, and this is what we've seen even more broadly. You look at the distribution of funds for disaster relief. They're going to red states. I mean, back when Trump was first elected in 2016, I began regularly to use the term kakistocracy. And I wrote a piece in the Atlantic called American Kakistocracy, a term that had gone completely out of use, which means government by the worst and most incompetent among us. And it literally the root of it is kaka, which you know what that means. So we now have a top official at FEMA who swears that at some point God teleported him several miles to another place and keeps doubling down on that. And they have not, they've gotten rid of a lot of the good people at FEMA. But even so, they're giving money to red states and withholding it from blue states. You look at this practice of cutting out selectively funds for Medicaid and other programs to Minnesota, but not to others. That is a complete violation of the law. The law is clear. Medicare, in particular, has formulas, the formulas that apply to all states. You can't say without Congress stepping in and changing the law that you're going to withhold funds for retribution from one state and not from others. And in particular, of course, if you look at the reasons for withholding those funds, they apply far more to Texas or some of the other states than they do to Minnesota. And I'm just very concerned about whether this Supreme Court is going to take its radical unitary executive theory further and enable this sort of thing to happen. So Minnesota is really at ground zero right now. And I do want to say, I was talking to a reporter earlier. I've watched with dismay, and we'll talk further about this, I'm sure, about the guardrails. The free and vigorous press is one of the most important guardrails we have, and it's disappearing all across the country. And the reaction of White House reporters, I mean, I saw an AP White House reporter put out as a headline yesterday, a completely sanitized version of Trump's horrible rant yesterday about Iran, normalizing it. And we've seen what happens when major media outlets are purchased by billionaires who have a political point of view or want to protect their own assets. We've seen local newspapers almost disappear because the economics of it just don't seem to work. I subscribe to the Star Tribune from Washington, which I'm delighted to do. That paper stood up, and it's been a model for what you want in a regional newspaper. And I just hope Peter Thiel doesn't buy it.
Okay. Norm Ornstein with Ted Mann, you published a book in 2008 called Broken Branch. 4 years,
2006.
2000, it was reissued.
Okay, yeah.
And then in 2012, you and Tom,
You're going to put your microphone up.
excuse me, I'll start again. In 2006, you published a book called Broken Branch. And then in 2012, you published a book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. What were the books about? What were you looking at? What was your reporting? And what was the explanation?
So to wind it back some, I came to Washington in 1969 as a congressional fellow to work on the Hill. I'd gone from being a student here as an undergraduate to the University of Michigan as a graduate student. And then a couple of years later, I moved back to Washington after finishing my dissertation and my first teaching job, which I got in Bologna, Italy, thanks to the late, great Frank Soroff, one of the stars of this university for many decades. And I've been immersed in Congress ever since, and as has my friend Tom Mann. We began to see, and we did projects going back in the 70s to try and make Congress work better, reforming almost every element of how it did its business and working with members of both parties who cared about their own institutions and wanted to make them work better. What we saw by 2006 was a transformation. And it was a Congress that was losing its core identity and responsibilities. You had problems with both parties. I mean, one part of it is Democrats were in the majority in the House of Representatives from 1954 to 1994. And there's a reality to power corrupts. When you're there for a long time and you think the majority is yours, the bright side of it was that because it was the Democrats believing it was their institution, they actually wanted to make the institution work, but they also got a little corrupt and complacent, and they were condescending to their own colleagues, and we saw a backlash to that. And when Newt Gingrich took advantage of that and marched into a majority, the place began to change. So when we wrote The Broken Branch, it really was about a Congress that was losing its way. And the speaker at that time was Dennis Hastert. And we saw deterioration. But by 2012, it was not both parties were responsible for a lot of this deterioration. What we had seen and it had begun before, but in the interim was a transformation of the Republican Party into what's become a cult, but what we called an insurgent outlier that was contemptuous of its opposition, of facts, of science. Newt, of course, one of the first things he did when he was speaker was to get rid of the Office of Technology Assessment, which was the experts in Congress who could look at legislation and say, no, that's not going to work. They didn't like experts because experts didn't conform with their more radical ideology. And of course, we've seen now the logical extension of what happens when you have disdain for experts. You get rid of the scientists, you get rid of the science, you get rid of every layer of expertise. And when we wrote that book, I have to say the publisher didn't want to use the title. It's even worse than it looks. She said, people don't buy books with downer titles. And I held my ground and insisted on it. But the day before it was published in the Outlook section, which no longer exists, in a paper that is no longer a good paper, the Washington Post, the then editor, Carlos Lozada, who now is the book critic for the New York Times, titled an excerpt from it, let's just say it, "The Republicans Are the Problem." And that boosted the book enormously, but it also meant a lot of people who we had worked with didn't want to talk to us. But I have to say, Larry, that the ones who were furious were the Republicans in office because it didn't fit their narrative. Republicans who had left office, including some from Minnesota, would call me up or see me and say, thank you for trying to save our party. We know you're not trying to destroy it, because you can't have a democracy without two problem-solving parties, whatever their ideologies may be. And what we saw then was the rise of, everybody talked about polarization. But as we tried to point out very carefully, you can be polarized and have very different views. But if you recognize a problem and believe that you have to solve the problem and understand that in a democracy, compromise is the way you have to go, you can get by. It's the tribalism. And Newt brought that tribalism. And that, of course, is the challenge that we have now. If you believe that the other side is evil, the enemy, and trying to destroy your way of life, you can justify anything that your corrupt leaders do, because to criticize them means you're giving aid and comfort to the enemy.
So I just want to pause and highlight some of the things that you've just mentioned. For most of your career, and frankly, when I first started to follow Norm Ornstein closely, you were, the person, in my mind, most closely associated with Congress. You were the leader of all sorts of reforms. You were the person working across the aisle. You think back to campaign finance reform. That was Norm Ornstein working with John McCain and Russ Feingold. And on and on and on. And you were someone who, really saw Congress as playing a vital role laid out in the Constitution and based on its history. And so for you to reach this conclusion, it was shocking. And okay, it's a broken branch. A lot of us read it and said, yeah, there's some problems here. But by the time he came out with, it's even worse than you think, it was like game up. And I think maybe for some people here or watching, it sounds familiar. I mean, some of the themes or the themes that you lay out in It's a Broken Branch are with us today, several further steps down the line.
It's gotten worse even than I feared, but it was really bad back then. But it's interesting. In 2015, I wrote a piece. Was then writing for the Atlantic, and I wrote a piece that was basically the status quo, what people expect. It's not going to happen. It's going to be different this time. And I got pushback from a lot of our political science colleagues. And my point was this notion that what Republicans do in their presidential nominating process is they flirt with an outsider, but then they come back and nominate the heir apparent. And most of our colleagues thought that that was going to happen again. It would be Jeb Bush. And I said very early on, this is a different party. And if it's not a Donald Trump, it's going to be somebody equally as radical and disdainful of the party. And then long before the nomination was secured, I wrote a piece called 8 Causes of Trumpism. This was before Trump had emerged as a nominee. Because if you were there, immersed in it, or just followed it, you could see the arc of history, which was bending towards injustice. And you could see that radical right-wing populism. I mean, we've had obviously all these instances of populism emerging. It's deep in our DNA. You go back to 1992 when you had the populism of the center with Ross Perot, and on the right with Pat Buchanan, and on the left with Ralph Nader. But usually it comes up when there's economic anxiety, and then it recedes when things get better. This was not receding. This was getting worse. And so you could see it coming. And you could see it was going to be bad. But I still had expectations that the guardrails would hold to some degree. What the framers knew, they knew you could end up with a tyrant or a corrupt figure as a president. But you had the courts, you had the Congress primarily, you had the press, you had civil society. I just did a piece with Madeline Dean, who's a wonderful member of Congress from Pennsylvania, on the abuse of the pardon power. And I mean, this is just quite remarkable, and it's out in the open. It's pardons of fraudsters who give tons of money to Trump or to his family or to his political funds, and then forgive the monies that are supposed to go to the victims of these crimes. It's, of course, starts with pardoning everybody on January 6th. And if you go back and look at the history of the pardon power, which goes back to like 7th century England, where it was about providing some sense of mercy if you had courts that abused their own power. And you have the framers saying, you know, should we do this? Should we do it with one individual? Well, even if somebody were to abuse it, we have impeachment, right? As if that's an effective bar against this stuff. I did not believe that we would lose almost all of those guardrails. And now we're seeing a little bit of pushback. It's the public here in Minnesota. It's lower court judges. It's some universities standing up. It's some law firms standing up. But let's face it, the reality is if all of the universities had stood together at the beginning and said, no, we're not going to take this shit, if the law firms had all stood together, it would have been a very different dynamic than we have now. And our challenge, of course, I mean, our longer challenge is getting back two parties that are problem-solving parties and not have one that's a cult. And you cannot operate as a democracy that way. And the second challenge is figuring out how we get back those institutional guardrails.
Rachel.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Norm. So I'm here to bring the student perspective, and I think many of us, I know myself, can definitely find a lot of truth in this phrase, it's even worse than it looks, especially now. But a lot of us are green, and we are entering this field, and we have a lot of optimism. And from your perspective, what can be done? What can we do? Is this blind optimism, or where do you think we should put our efforts towards?
This is going to be a real challenge for people in your generation and the generations to come. And it's a challenge that goes beyond repairing our politics. It's repairing our society. I see a lot of good signs out there. I see a generation that isn't driven by a monomaniacal focus on gender or race or religion, a much greater understanding, tolerance of humanity as a general matter. On the other hand, I'm very fearful because I've seen too many surveys that show young people have disdain for democracy. And I can kind of understand it. I mean, before we started, I was talking with the great Mike Freeman, who's here in this audience, Hennepin County attorney for 30 plus terrific years, but from a family, a legacy that anybody who grew up in Minnesota admired and admired the leadership that we had. We lived through some golden years and grew up in golden years when government, imperfect as it is, worked, when people worked together, when the focus was on solving problems. I was mentioning earlier before we started to a reporter from MinPost that when I was a student here, I became friends with and was mentored by Doug Head, who had been the Republican Attorney General. Brilliant, compassionate, terrific guy. And I believed, and we had a Republican Party back then, the party of the Arnie Carlsons and the party of the Bill Frenzels and the Jim Ramstads, that you could admire as working for the greater good. So we saw times when the imperfections of a democracy were overcome by good people making them work. We have generations now that have seen only bickering, gridlock, attempts to divide rather than unite. And there are too many surveys of young people that suggest they'd flirt with having a dictator if it happened to be one they liked. or that don't understand what it means to have to put yourself out to create that sense of unity and to work within a political system that is built on small d democratic values. And let me say, I've had a back and forth for a while with somebody who's actually a poster child for everything that's gone wrong, Mike Lee, the senator from Utah. I knew his father a little bit. Rex Lee was Solicitor General under Reagan, was a good man of integrity. Mike Lee, not so much. But, he always says, we're a republic, not a democracy. Well, what does that mean? A republic, a Republican form of democracy, is where voters elect representatives who represent them. What happens when you elect representatives who don't represent you, who turn their backs on their own constituents, who don't respond to issues where there's an overwhelming desire for a policy? 90% of Americans believe there ought to be background checks for guns. Goes nowhere. Looking at some of, frankly, some of the Republicans here who, when Operation Metro Surge was taking place, or when you have the president making these vile racist attacks on all Somalians, saying nothing or encouraging it. If that's what we mean by a democracy now, we're going to have a lot of work to do. You're going to have a lot of work to do, Rachel, to convince your peers. And then, of course, we have the broader issues of what kinds of jobs are going to be available for people as we move into this new era, including with AI. What are the jobs that are going to be available? How are people going to live good lives? And those are things that our generations, are leaving you to clean up the mess that will affect your own lives. And thank goodness we have schools like the Humphrey School that at least is bringing out people who have the skills and the outlook to try and make sure we can make it work.
Norm, you started your career working with Henry Kissinger. Curious, Kissinger still lives. If Henry Kissinger was alive today, how do you think he would analyze the situation in the Middle East?
So it's a long story. I've had a sort of Zelig-like experience of having just a number of mentors emerge. I mean, both the Minnesota ones, the Humphreys, the Mondales, the Freemans, the Frasers. And I worked for Don Fraser. And every time I would come back here, Don and Arvon, when they were here, would show up. And I had, the John McCains, the Alan Simpsons, the Elliot Richardsons, all people I ended up getting pretty close to and working with. I met Kissinger in the 90s when I was up in New York to do election coverage for CBS. And David Rockefeller was the head of Chase Manhattan Bank. And he said, it was right before an election, would you come and speak to have a international board of advisors, and Kissinger was their counselor. So I gave a talk, and Kissinger came up afterwards and said, I was very impressed. I didn't know much about American politics. Would you have lunch with me? And I said I could probably work out the schedule, figure out a way to do it. And he asked me if I would from time to time. Back then he had this firm where he had like 20 clients who paid him a ton of money to come and visit 2 or 3 times a year. Half of it so he could do a kind of risk analysis for, half of it so the CEOs could say to their peers. So at dinner with Henry last night, and I would travel with him, and it was quite amazing because he'd been out of office for decades, but was treated like a king wherever we went. He and I, would spend time with him sometimes afterwards. He had become too much of a partisan Republican, where he went along with things that he knew were wrong, but it was because he was a Republican. But this would be a bridge far too far for him. And in particular, to watch the degradation of American foreign policy, the degradation of America's role in the world, the degree to which every one of our allies treats the president, and I'm afraid it's going to persist afterwards, with contempt. the fact that half of the reasons or half of the terrorist attacks that might be attempted here in the United States are thwarted because of foreign intelligence where our allies share their most sensitive sources and methods to put it off. Why would any country, France, Germany, Britain, Japan, Australia, share those things with a government that will immediately give the information over to the Russians? And so we're losing something on that front. And I think he would view that with contempt. He would look at the way negotiations played out or didn't with Iran, with two people manifestly wrong for the roles of negotiating for the United States. Somebody with no official role except just mostly wanting to enrich his own pocket with more money for his funds in Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. Steve Witkoff, who I sometimes call half Witkoff, but who knows nothing about these issues. And two people who refuse to bring in interpreters from our government who didn't want nuclear experts around them when they were negotiating with the Iranians, but who also apparently had a deal on the table that could have been a pretty good deal and didn't know what that deal was doing, which is why we're now deep in this quagmire. I just can't believe Kissinger would view that with anything except contempt.
I want to just pursue this for a second. We're now are starting to see the consequences of this war, certainly the economic consequences globally and here in the United States with new numbers coming out about inflation, accentuating the deep concern many Americans have about not being able to afford the basics of life. But also we're seeing it in terms of polls. Donald Trump's approval rating is now below 40%. It's a new low for him. We're seeing, and this is very important, the intensity of those who disapprove of him is extraordinary. It's over 80% strongly disapprove. And those of us who study politics know intensity is often the name of the game. And then you look at the reactions to the war in Iran. And it's interesting, there's a lot of talk about the Republican unity around Donald Trump in terms of his base. Okay, there's a lot of support there, but it's also the percent of Republicans and MAGA who are disapproving or now kind of shifting away to a don't know, which is a kind of a halfway station, is upwards of 30%. It's significant. 2/3 of independents disapprove of this war. So how does that factor into this dismal situation that you've just described?
There has to be a tipping point at which the number of his core supporters, the true cult believers, declines enough that the Tom Emmers of the world decide that maybe they got to get a little distance from him. What that point is and whether we reach that point, I'm not sure. The cognitive dissonance of so many cultists who believed that this guy was the true coming, the second coming, not wanting to move away from that and to believe that they were wrong is going to keep a significant portion of that base there. But at the same time, it's very hard to put the best face on what's happened with Iran and come up with a good outcome. It is hard to imagine. I mean, it's not impossible to imagine that they'll get a ceasefire now for a period of time. But frankly, that ceasefire, if Iran agrees to it, is mostly so that they can shore up their weapons and capability of hitting back if they hit back again, trying to find alternative sources for energy, electricity, and water if we, in fact, end up committing the war crimes of taking out their civilian infrastructure, and using the Strait of Hormuz and manipulating it, even if it's opened up, basically still, saying, okay, down the road, you want to use the strait, you're going to have to pay more. I mean, all of that. But let's say we get that better outcome, and at least for a period of time, in the critical period of time, the fertilizer comes through for planting season, which prevents a global crisis of starvation and upheaval and inflation and prices going up. It's not going to get much better. And I have to say one thing about Trump that I find absolutely stunning. His understanding of economics would not meet a third grade level. Tariffs, he has no idea what tariffs are, what trade is. But to say, as he did in his speech the other night, we're self-sufficient in energy, screw the rest of the world, we don't have to worry about it, not even understanding that it's a global marketplace, much less not understanding that while we produce enough oil in theory for America, a lot of it we have to import because our refineries are not capable of dealing with the oil that we have. It's just astonishing to me. But the fact is, all of this disruption is going to cause gasoline prices to stay much higher. It means that the helium that we need for critical, as part of the critical elements for making chips, for doing all the other things, is going to make it much more expensive. Food costs, beyond question, are going to go up. I saw an interview with a fisherman the other day who said, you know, diesel fuel, which we use in our boats, has gone up so much, and the price of fish has not. We may have to stop fishing. And that's going to cause even more shortages and disruption. All of that leaves us in a very bad place. And what that means politically, to circle back to what you were saying, and here I take it to a program that Larry has run for a number of years, which is a critical one, which is to train election officials, which are thankless tasks for most of them, either poorly paid or not paid. But we get people of integrity who want the elections to work, to get them out there to do their jobs and to do them knowing what they're supposed to be doing. How does Trump react if his standing drops enough that not only will the House and Senate likely go if the election is free and fair, but a huge number of state legislatures and some red state governors, all of those could go down the drain? Is he going to say either, one, I better change my policies or we're screwed, or two, well, I tried and the American people will have their will, or three, I'm going to distort these elections and suppress enough votes that no matter what, I can prevail. Let's see how Viktor Orban does it, maybe with a false flag, or four, I'm going to find a way to cancel the elections. And the reality is 3 or 4 are the ones that we're looking at. And that's where all of us, including all of Rachel's colleagues and Rachel herself, and all of those who care about elections and our governance, including the governor here, the attorney general here, the secretary of state here, have to mobilize. We have to make sure that if they send the military to polling places, I will tell you, being a little cynical, but also realistic, we have a trial going on now of Maduro, and he is likely to be convicted. And I do not think it is out of the question that Todd Blanche will visit him and say, look, we got a couple of choices here. I can send you to a hellhole prison, or maybe down to Dilley, or I can find you and your wife's cells right around the corner from Ghislaine Maxwell, and you'll be able to play golf, and you can go out and maybe visit with family or friends. And if you want the latter, all you have to do is sign this affidavit saying that Venezuela turned the election in 2016 away from, or 2020 away from Donald Trump. And then use that as there's foreign interference, and we're going to have to go in and seize the ballots before they're counted. We know ICE, he's already said that he'll have ICE waiting at the polling places. We know that even if the Save America Act doesn't pass Congress, I think it probably will in reconciliation, even though that's against all the rules. But we have Florida now passing its own version of the SAVE Act. And we know that Trump is going to try and may succeed in cutting out mail ballots in a lot of places. He's already here. I take great fault with Joe Biden, who did not grab control of the Postal Service, had vacancies on the board that they did not fill or waited way too late to nominate people. It's now a Trumpist board. They've already said they're not going to postmark ballots when they first arrive at a station, but only when they're at the distribution center, which means very likely there'll be plenty of ballots cast a week or 10 days before the election that get postmarked after the election. All of those things is what we all need to be worried about now. Our last best defense is the election in November.
Rachel?
Yeah. So kind of going off of that election talk, bringing back to my generation or this upcoming generation's disdain for democracy that you mentioned, I do feel a lot of it does come from distrust and almost a sense, especially with the Republican Party being as divisive as it is, a viewpoint of the Democratic Party almost floundering in response and having elections be almost, a lot of people feel pointless in a sense. Or how do we protect this? How do we bring back the importance of that? And how can the Democratic Party regain strength and its trust within its own constituents?
That is a really good point, Rachel. And the fact is the Democratic Party's standing is maybe even a little bit worse than the Republican Party at the moment. I think it's partly a broader sense that Democrats, well, there are two things. One, Democrats didn't govern very well. And I hope all of you read Larry's piece about Walter Mondale and efficiency and the failures of the Democrats running this state in dealing with fraud and abuse. And it's also that if you look at the bills that Joe Biden managed to get through, which were remarkable in terms of advances in policy, that didn't have any impact on the ground because there were so many obstacles in place, including regulations and provisions that Democrats had put in, all for good reasons, for environmental reasons, for equity reasons, whatever they may be. And that's why this debate over abundance is beginning to take place. Clearly, Democrats need to find a better way of dealing with their own problems in governance and with getting policies that matter to people and then finding ways to implement them without, destroying every one of their own values. But it's also, I think, a belief that when we began to see these terrible abuses, Democrats didn't fight back. And here I blame the Democratic leaders in Congress, who I think continue to have too much of a blind eye about what they need to do to fight back. The attitude for many is, hey, it's about affordability. That's all that it's about. And we're winning on that front. And they are. People, inflation is now biting significantly. There are going to be even more disruptions. All those people who ended up losing their health care or having to pay far more money than they had before because of what the Republicans have done. Okay, we're winning on that front, and that's all we need to do. Don't rock the boat. Don't focus on what a lot of people don't care about, which is democracy, governance, and all of that. I think that's a huge mistake. You can do both, and you need to do both. And you need to push back against the horrible things that have been happening. And you need to use every tool you have inside Congress, just as states need to use the tools that they have to show that this is wrong and you're not going to put up with it. And there are a lot of individual members who are doing the right thing. I actually interact with a lot of them on a regular basis. When I mentioned Madeline Dean, but Jamie Raskin and Sheldon Whitehouse and Jim McGovern and Peter Welch, there are a whole lot who understand what these problems are and understand that we've got to go the extra mile and not do things the normal way. Frankly, I think for Democrats in the Senate, there's still way too much of this sense of the old boy network. They still pal around with these Republicans. They joke with them on the floor. They think Lindsey Graham's a funny, nice guy. I'm sorry. Lindsey Graham is a monster. And I sort of say on a regular basis, someday we'll find out what turned Lindsay, and it will not be pretty. You cannot look at those personal relationships and let them transcend your larger responsibility. And there, I think, if Democrats don't do that, they can win an election, but they're not going to win the next war. And one of the things that I worry about very much is, let's say that it works out, Democrats win the House, win the Senate, win the White House. One, we're going to have a dilemma. Do we take on those people who did these horrible things? From my perspective, I want a Nuremberg. We have murders, deaths, horrible things happening. People have to be held accountable for them. But there'll be a backlash from that. There'll be a lot of people who want to just move on. And there'll be a lot of people who will say, it's the Merrick Garland model. We just have to operate with integrity, and that will demonstrate things. Fact is, because we've lost our expertise, because we have agencies that have been devastated, if you try and get the scientists and researchers and doctors who've left NIH, NIMH, CDC, who are going to go out and over 4 years find new jobs, new careers, and say to them, come on back. They're going to say, look, I've already established myself now. I'm not going to disrupt my family or career again. And two, how do I know it won't be another 4 years? I'll be out again. And the fact is, it's going to be a rough period of time. We have to understand that. We're not going to govern well, even if we have people who want to govern well. And in 4 years, if there's inflation, if there's disruption, people will have forgotten, and they'll say, throw the ins out and bring the outs in, and we could be back in the same situation. And if the Democratic Party doesn't recognize that, and if its leaders don't recognize that and respond to it, I don't know how much longer Larry or I will be around for it, but your generation will, and I would fear the consequences.
Norm, I want to just tap into your vast expertise about Congress and how it works. Of course, there's a filibuster in the Senate, which means you need 60 votes to move legislation, and that's a hurdle for both parties. Donald Trump, of course, is gnashing his teeth about it, and so far he's not been able to eliminate it, though over the years it's been weakened. There do appear to be a growing number of Republican senators who are either not running for reelection, Tillis from North Carolina being one, or are running for reelection. Collins from Maine is one, or will be running for reelection and are concerned about this turn in the country. You have studied the way in which Congress can use legislation and even the reconciliation package to insert conditions, insert reporting requirements. Can you give us a sense of if there are well-meaning Republicans who are acting out of a sense of the institution or out of saving their own hide, what could they do to slow down Donald Trump and particularly the war in Iran, but also the operations of ICE?
So one of the things that's been so shocking and disappointing to me is one of the great powers of Congress is oversight. When horrible things happen, or when there's malfeasance, or when there's just a failure to implement, the Constitution says that the executive sees that the laws be faithfully executed, the laws that Congress passes. If they're not being faithfully executed, if there are mistakes or terrible things happening, Congress has to use its power of the purse and its power of oversight to bring them back. We've had none of that. Here's what I fear from this, Larry, which is Republicans, if they come to believe, Republicans in the Senate, that their majority is going to go down, they will go to extraordinary lengths to pass this Save America Act. It may not work the way they want it to work, but it can be manipulated to make it work for them. And that may mean that they bite the bullet and change the filibuster rule. They don't want to do it. And they don't want to do it not just because they fear what will happen if down the road Democrats take over and they're the ones who brought the rule down. They also don't want to do it because there are there are two or three types of Republicans in the Senate right now. There are the true believers who really they're all in on the cult. That's the Marsha Blackburns of the world. There are those who basically believe that no matter what, no matter their flaws, they're better than the other side. And so they got to stand up for it, even if they don't like it. And then there are those who are scared to death, fear the retribution. And it's fearing physical violence against them because they're getting threats. It's also the fear of being shunned by your friends, that you're an apostate. How much of that gets overcome if you lose a filibuster rule where you can blame the failure to act in policies that your constituents want on the other side. And if you get rid of the filibuster, the pressure on all of them to go along is even more intense. But they'll do it if they think their hides are at stake. And the other thing that they will do, if they don't get rid of the filibuster, which they don't want to do, which we alluded to before, is to use reconciliation. Reconciliation, as most of you probably know, if you don't, was put into a budget process created in the backlash against Richard Nixon in the Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. It was supposed to be a kind of minor feature. You do your budget, you do your spending, you do your taxing bills, and then at the end, you can sort of in a technical way reconcile it all so that you make sure that the spending and the taxing all fit together. But then it came to be misused because built into it was a fast track procedure that gave it a privileged status. It had to come to a vote, and it only took a majority in the Senate. So it was the one way to avoid a filibuster. They've used it for tax cuts. They used it for the Affordable Care Act. It has in the Senate something called the Byrd Rule. Robert Byrd built in something that said, no, you can't use this. I mean, you can't use it for anything except where the primary function is spending or taxing. You can't use it if it adds to the deficit or the debt beyond a 10-year period. And the parliamentarian rules in these things. But the way the Senate works, if the parliamentarian said, no, you can't put the SAVE Act into reconciliation, it's not primarily about the budget. If it is about the budget, it's because you're getting revenue from a poll tax by forcing people to pay to get passports or birth certificates. So you can't include it. Somebody can appeal the ruling of the chair. And in the Senate, it's only 50 votes to overrule the parliamentarian and the chair. They could use that to do the SAVE Act. It's against their own rules. It's presumably against the law. No court is going to intervene in that case. So I don't think it's out of the question that we end up with the SAVE Act. And, the fact is they will regret what they did, but they'll still do it if it means their own majority.
Even with some of these members like Tillis, who's not running,
Put your mic on.
even with some of the members who are not running for election, like Tillis, who's clearly off the reservation,
Yeah.
and the more moderate members who are looking at their constituents, thinking about election in 26 or in the coming years. Let's say there are 4 or 5 Republicans who refuse to go along. Does that mean that even with reconciliation, Donald Trump's going to have trouble?
I can imagine that you could put together a reconciliation bill that also, under pressure from Trump, includes his demands for taking everything out of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, health care, education, so you can give more to the military, would be a bridge too far for a lot of Republicans. So they may end up negotiating over some of that. What we know is, even with, in the House, of course, with that narrow majority, if 5 Republicans had stood together and said, no, we're not going to do this, they would have been in a very different world. In the Senate, if 4 Republicans had done that, we would be in a different world. The reality is, you got Tillis on a few votes. You got Bill Cassidy on a few votes. You've got the so-called moderates, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. For years, there's been a wink and a nod with the leaders, with Mitch McConnell. You can vote against us to help yourself back home if it won't matter in the final outcome. And if you noticed with the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation, Susan Collins was the deciding vote. And what did she do? She said, he's promised me he won't reverse Roe v. Wade, and went along. And I cannot find a single instance where the two of them were deciding votes against horrific nominees for the courts, cabinet or sub-cabinet positions. You can find votes against, but not where it made the difference. And at this point, I'm pessimistic enough that unless we have an utter collapse, I don't see Republicans. You know, for Lisa Murkowski, who was abandoned by her own Republican Party 8 years ago, or however long ago it was, when they denied her renomination, and she ran on a write-in and won, and stayed as a Republican. Instead of becoming an independent, she ran as an independent, where she actually would have had enormous influence as a deciding force, and stuck with it and continues to do so through all of these outrages. You know, you look at this cabinet. How could they confirm a Pete Hegseth? How could they confirm a Robert F. Kennedy Jr.? How could they go unanimously for a Marco Rubio who's abandoned? You know, I have to say, sometimes I'll say he's lost his soul, but you have to have a soul to begin with to lose it. And now going along with all of this, including basically supporting the potential for horrific war crimes. But every one of these cabinet members should have gotten a vetting. Sub-cabinet members. I mean, we may see his nominee for Surgeon General go down without a vote, because you have a person who has no qualifications whatsoever for that post. But it's because it's in some ways a lower level post and it doesn't matter very much for them. In every other instance, including judges manifestly unqualified and people who are corrupt, they go along. So it's hard for me, Larry, to say, oh, there'll come a time when the tide will turn.
Rachel, last question.
Last question. So I think the biggest thing that I'm thinking about now going forward is and we've briefly touched on this, is the role of media and now AI within elections, within representation. Just your thoughts going forward on policies that may impact that.
We're in a really bad place with our communications and our mass media, and that includes, of course, social media. You know, the reality at this point is, if this merger with Paramount and Warner Brothers Discovery goes through, and states may be able to block it, and European countries may be able to block it, but if it happens, we're basically going to have the overwhelming majority of our mainstream media controlled by a tiny group of billionaires who are fundamentally in Donald Trump's pocket. And at the same time, if you look at the main instruments of social media, Trump manipulated TikTok, violating our own laws, so that it could end up being purchased by Peter Thiel and some of these other billionaires who are radical right-wingers. You know, the tech billionaires basically believe democracy is terrible. We need little techno states that are run by people like us. These are the people who ran Doge and who have no understanding at all about much of anything in the world. And they now control almost every avenue of social media. I just saw a little graph put up, Nate Silver put it up, of the main actors on Twitter. And if you take a look at that, it's overwhelmingly right-wing ones. They're promoting them, they're getting them out there to everybody and squashing others. They are able to manipulate this. I will never forget after the 2016 campaign, when we knew that Facebook was basically giving a green light to Russia to come in and put all of this terrible stuff out there. And there was a hearing in the Senate, and the Facebook executive said, well, how are we to know it was Russia? And our Senator Al Franken said, because they were paying you in rubles? And has that changed? No. And it's now Russia and China, and they're bringing in money, and they're happy to do it. And when you had Mark Zuckerberg sitting next to Trump at this dinner with the tech executives saying, we're going to invest $600 million or however much it was, some outrageous sum in America. And Trump said, great. And then with the hot mic, Zuckerberg leaned over and said, was that enough? Was that okay? Because he just made it up. These are the people who are running our media now. And if we can't preserve outlets like the Minneapolis, Minnesota Star Tribune, and have outlets at least that are honest, if we can't, and the New York Times, for whatever flaws it has, and its headlines still sometimes are pretty bad, but it is standing and doing the right thing for the most part. But we need obviously more than that. And the White House press corps, which has become a joke, basically, treated horribly by Trump, by the press secretary, by everybody else. The general press corps covering the administration, what Pete Hegseth did, all of that. If we don't get pushback from the people who are spreading this information, and the Times becomes important because it's still the sort of standard that's used by almost all of the other media out there for what's important, whether it's a headline, whether it's repeated. We're going to be in a bad place. And I don't know how we recover from all of that. And it's, we expected, obviously, you go back, we had partisan newspapers, really partisan stuff going back to the framing, to the early days, the colonial days, the early days of the Republic. But there was still this expectation, and it was implicit in Federalist 10, that we'd have competition, but that the core would be that they would be there to hold officials accountable. If you lose that, if you have billionaires able to run our elections, dominate our elections, and dominate our means of communication, then we lose the core of what we need to have a vibrant society and democracy. And we've got a real challenge ahead of us on that. And I just don't know why we haven't had billionaires who understand this step up. And, I wish Mark Cuban had gone in early on, right after David Zaslav took over the Time Warner operation and was deeply in debt and needed to get rid of some of those assets. Would have been wonderful if somebody had come in and said, we'll give you a bunch of money, even more than it's worth, for CNN, and then take it out and maybe even turn it into a nonprofit. But, we had expectations that Jeff Bezos would do the right thing, buy the Washington Post, and if it lost $100 million a year, that would be like my, losing a quarter in the cushions in the sofa. And now, of course, because he has other business interests, sold out completely. And that's happening almost everywhere. It happened with the Los Angeles Times. It's happening as we get hedge funds buying newspapers, consolidating them, and getting rid of all of what we need for checks and balances through our media. So it's a real challenge.
Rachel and I would like to thank Norm Ornstein for joining us. Thank you very much. We'd also like to thank Ryan Allen for helping to organize today's event, and to everyone else who played a role. And thanks to all of you for coming, including those who joined us online.
And I would just note, for those in the audience who don't know or who haven't signed up, At 4:30 today, we're going to be screening a documentary that my family spearheaded on urban debate. Minnesota has one of the most vibrant urban debate leagues for kids from public schools to learn those life skills and understand the value of civil discourse. And then we'll have a little panel afterwards, and you're all welcome to come. And I will say, just as we go, Larry, I promote civil discourse everywhere, but it's a challenge. I was at a program a few weeks ago with the governor of Utah, who has Spencer Cox, who spearheaded this idea of disagree better. And he did a program with Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. And they both agreed that we need to live by the maxim of love our enemies, embrace our enemies. And my reaction to that is, I will do that for those with whom I have profound policy differences. But I would not have loved Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini, or people who are viciously taking away lives and property and values from those. We have to speak out against those. It's a fine line and a balance we have to strike. But when you see these kids from public schools get out there and debate, it makes you feel much, much better about the future of the country.
And I just want to say this: the program that you've helped to sponsor in Minneapolis, it's all over the country. You've got this. It's really remarkable. This is not kind of a program for the well-heeled kids in the suburbs. You've really gone all over the country to make sure that there are opportunities and that this basic skill of citizenship is something that is shared.
And I just want to note that we take these kids mostly from Title I schools. We do this in the Washington, D.C. area. A lot of them from really terrible backgrounds. And you watch them when you give them the tools, the brilliance that's there. And then you have to realize how many brilliant kids there are out there who will not get those tools and will not be able to emerge in a way that's not just for them, but for the society as a whole. And being able to spread that is an imperative. But let's face it, we're also dealing at a time with the war on diversity, equity, and inclusion, cutting out programs, whether it's Head Start, early childhood education, child nutrition, public education, the war on public education, where it's going to be much tougher. And I just talking about loving your enemies, a business community that's losing the future workforce of America, which is a diverse workforce, by taking away all of those resources, undercutting the education system, doing it and letting it happen and saying nothing. Business and financial leaders who say nothing so that they can get their lower tax rates and get their absence of regulations, because they're not going to be around when the next generations have to deal with the problems that are caused. These are also not enemies I want to embrace or love.
Thank you very much, Norman Ornstein. Again, thanks to all of you.